how to use your camera settings to take better photos. Hi, and a very warm welcome to episode 180 of the Photography Explained podcast. How did that happen? I'm your host Rick, and in each episode I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 27 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. I'm a professionally qualified photographer based in England with a lifetime of photographic experience, which I share with you in my podcast. Here is the answery bit. There are many settings that we can change in cameras, and lenses too. These settings will change depending on what you're taking a photo of, and the ambient light levels, and the subject matter of course, and basically everything else in the photo. But with the correct camera settings, we can take better photos. I mean, that's why our cameras have got all those settings after all, haven't they? So, get your camera set up for you and take better photos. How utterly splendid. So, why are there so many camera settings? Now, there seem to be 1,000,001 camera settings. Now, I break these down into 3 different types, which I covered in 3 previous episodes. They were episode 101, Things That You Can Set and Forget. Sorry, the full title was Camera Settings, Things That You Can Set and Forget. Episode 102, Camera Settings, Things That You Might Change When Out Taking Photos. And episode 103, Camera Settings, the Things That You Set for Each Photo You Take. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself here. I am going to pick up on some of the stuff, obviously. But if you check out those 3 episodes, they're only 11-12 minutes long because they were published in January 2022 when what I did was published what was meant to be a less than 10-minute episode. So I never managed that, but 11-12 minutes didn't do it for me. So that's why we're at about 27 to 30-ish minutes. But what I talked about then, it still applies, and yeah, I've still got the same cameras back in January 2022, the Canon 6D. And yes, back then, the episodes were much shorter than they are now, but once a week. So, yeah, I went from 10-minute episodes weekly to fortnightly episodes nearly 30 minutes long, so it didn't quite work out how I planned, but it wasn't about saving time, it was about doing better episodes. So I'm happy with how it all ended up. And I'm so glad I didn't call episode 101 Photography 101. I seem to remember being tempted at the time. That was January 2022. So good decision, Rick, there. Good decision. There is one point I want to repeat from those episodes, and it's this. Go through your camera manual with your camera and find out what settings there are and what you can turn on and indeed turn off. Now, I've did this with my Canon 6D and I'd had it a couple of years and then I did it and I found stuff which I didn't want it to do, which I never even knew about. So yes, I've been that sad. I've sat down, I've set aside some time and I've sat down with my camera and a lens, memory card in, battery in, and I've gone through the manual and tried everything. I've actually done that, and I keep on going back to it. And my Canon 6D manual, it's actually on the desktop on my computer, and it's one of my most frequently used reference sources. So camera manuals are brilliant things. Massive digression here. If you check out camera manuals from old film cameras, they're amazing for explaining photography to you. So have a look at some old stuff. You can view it online. They don't cost anything. And there's some really good stuff in there because the principles still apply. Right, let's get back on track here. There are loads of different cameras out there and they've all got their own settings, different names, different terminologies, different combinations. I have to leave you to sort out your camera. I can't tell you that. But what I can do is this. I can cover a few things, the most important camera settings, and they are the main camera settings for exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, in that order, RAW or JPEG, picture taking modes, white balance, manual mode, autofocus, drive modes, live view, auto bracketing, metering modes, and some lens related stuff too, of course, focal lengths, image stabilization, and let's not forget my good old friend, tripods. Yes, I think there's more than enough for what I was hoping would be a shorter episode, but now I've written the script, I know it's not going to be. But hey, let's not that put us off, eh? But I want to talk about these things in the context of how changing them can help us take better photos. And that's the underlying theme for all the episodes at the moment. It was meant to be 11 episodes, but it might end up being 20. But all good stuff, I'm happy with that. So let's get stuck into camera settings. Oh yeah, before I go on, if there are any camera settings you want me to explain, just let me know and I can cover them in another episode, not a problem at all. Just head over to the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com. Right, aperture, shutter speed and ISO. These are the three elements of the exposure triangle. And I'm going to say well sort of here because I don't quite see it like that. Now, I'm not a big fan of the exposure triangle concept thing, and I don't think I've ever used it, but I'll explain what I mean in a bit, because I think I see things in a slightly different way. But let's get back to the fundamentals. Your camera is recording light. Photography is drawing with light. So the aperture is the size of the opening in the lens, and this determines how much light gets through. The shutter speed is the time the camera sensor is exposed to light. The shutter speed is not the speed of the shutter. It is the time the camera sensor is exposed to light, which is why I'd call it exposure time if I had my way in my brave new world of photography. More on that in another episode. And ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor. Ish. I'm saying ish because if you increase the ISO, you are not changing the camera sensor's sensitivity to light. You're not, because that's fixed. No, this is what's happening. If you increase the ISO, you are electrically amplifying the signal and you're making photos brighter. See, if you put it like that, it doesn't sound as attractive, does it? No, it doesn't, does it? So how do aperture, shutter speed and ISO help you to take better photos? How indeed, Rick? Well, my starting point is to use the lowest ISO setting that my camera has. And on my Canon 6D, it's 100. Then select an aperture and shutter speed that give you the correct exposure. If you can't get a fast enough shutter speed to get a sharp photo handheld, increasing the ISO is another option. Another option is to use a larger aperture, smaller number helpfully, to let more light in. And that's the process. If you increase the ISO, you increase the risk of digital bad stuff. And each camera has a different point at which digital bad stuff kicks in. And you need to know what that is for your camera. And digital bad stuff, also known as noise, it can be dealt with in processing to a point. But a low ISO is a good ISO in my book. Having said that, a photo with some digital bad stuff is still better than a blurry photo though. If the shutter speed's too slow and you're taking a photo handheld, you might get camera shake. No, the camera's not shaking, that's just the term that we have. And if you get camera shake, you get a blurry photo. So yeah, increasing the ISO is better than having a blurry photo. This is the only time I change the ISO, when I have to. When I can't get a sharp photo handheld, using ISO 100. That is the only time I will ever change the ISO. But there are other things that you can do in photography. You've always got options, and my preferred option, put your camera on a tripod. That's what I do, and the problem's gone. Stick with ISO 100. Doesn't matter how dark it is, because I'm photographing buildings and they're not moving. Well, I hope they're not. And that just leaves me with the aperture and shutter speed to sort out. So let's move on to the aperture, because there's a reason I'm going through them in this order. Now, for every lens, there is a sweet spot, which is an aperture which gives the sharpest images and the least optical errors. On my Canon 17 to 40mm lens, it's f8, it might be f11. So I use f8 all the time because it gives me the highest quality and it gives me the depth of field that I need using the 17mm focal length. See, this all has to tie together. And I only ever change to f16 if I need more depth of field, which isn't that often. Now, depth of field it's the depth of sharpness in a photo, which is why I've renamed depth of field depth of sharpness. It is the amount of a photo that is sharp from front to back. Okay, need to get that one out of the way. So, a small aperture, large number helpfully, gives more depth of field than a large aperture, which is a small number. I know, it's not here to help us, is it? The depth of field also varies with where you focus, the focal length used, the sensor size, and your proximity to the subject matter and the background. Yeah, I covered sensor size in the last episode, so if you haven't listened to that yet, check out episode 179. Photography gear, how cameras, lenses, and other stuff help. And what a splendid episode it was. But these principles apply regardless of sensor size. Large aperture, shallow depth of field. Small aperture, deep depth of field. Now, I don't really like the term deep depth of field. Shallow depth of field's fine, but deep's the logical opposite to that. But I think there's better ways of describing it. Another one is more depth of field. I think that'll do, won't it? Yeah, why not, Rick? Why not? But we must remember there are issues using maximum and minimum apertures on all lenses. The sweet spot's what we're after. Obviously, it depends what you're after in terms of depth of field. But for me, photographing buildings, highest quality and the depth of field I need. So I go with the sweet spot, minimal errors. It depends what you're doing. You might need to use the maximum aperture or the minimum aperture for the photos you're taking. But if you do that, you can get optical errors, softness, distortions and other bad stuff happening with the maximum and minimum apertures. So check out your lens. There's reviews where you can find out exactly what's going on when you use those, but they're nowhere near as sharp as the sweet spot. Right, aperture done. How does the shutter speed help us to get the best image captures? Well, the shutter speed, first off, it should be appropriate for the subject matter and the focal length that you're using. When taking photos handheld, you should use a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or faster, and the shutter speed should be larger than the reciprocal of the focal length. I know. Let me give you an example. It's not as bad as it sounds. If you're using a focal length of 200 millimeters, the minimum shutter speed should be 1/250th of a second. There you go. It wasn't that bad, was it? Not surprisingly, fast-moving subjects require a faster shutter speed to capture them sharply. And you can use a slower shutter speed for slow-moving subjects, but be careful, a slow shutter speed could cause camera shake, resulting in a blurry photo. And you can also use a slow shutter speed to create motion blur. That's one for another time. But for me, I'm looking for the sharpest photos that I can every time with the highest quality image capture. So I use a tripod, and that problem, as I've said before, and I'll keep on saying it, I'm fine repeating this, use a tripod, use the aperture that you want with a low ISO, shutter speed doesn't matter because my subject's not moving, and I get the highest quality images, which is what I'm after. Have I said that before? Yes, you have. Okay. Stop talking to yourself, Rick. Move on. Do RAW or JPEG picture formats record the best photos? Well, RAW photos are unprocessed, apart from the processing used to create the image, that is, and JPEGs have got some processing done to them in camera. So RAW's a file type and JPEG is a file type as well. I use RAW and do all the adjustments myself. This means that I am in complete control of the edits. Now, if you want to use JPEG, that's up to you, and cameras these days can produce some pretty amazing results. So this is what I suggest you do. Try both. With my Canon 6D, I could take photos in RAW and JPEG at the same time. So have a go at this and spend some decent time editing a couple of images in both. And if you can't tell the difference, which there is a decent possibility of, JPEG might be okay for you, and this saves you time and it allows you to use much smaller files. But if you want complete control, like I do, use RAW. But if you're using RAW, if you want to share the photos with somebody else, you've got to convert them to JPEG anyway. So there are advantages to JPEG. And within RAW and JPEG, there are many different quality settings. I think there's about 9 for JPEG and 3 for RAW. But I only ever use the highest quality setting, which is RAW. It's just called RAW. And that is the largest file size, but file size isn't an issue to me because I'm set up so it's not a problem. But that is an important factor for people. file size. JPEG files are compressed, they're much smaller. So if JPEG works for you, there's nothing wrong with it. You don't have to use RAW. Just because I do and other professional photographers do, you don't have to use RAW to get great photos. It depends. And the gap between the two is closing with the advancements in image capture and processing. Right, that's RAW and JPEG. There are other file formats, but those are the two main ones. Right, let's move on. Picture taking modes. Well, what are the different picture taking modes? There's loads, but they come into these distinct categories. Fully automatic modes, where the camera does everything. Fully automatic but scene-specific modes with camera settings designed for a particular subject matter, such as portrait, landscape. Well, you got backlit night HDR, I think, on the Canon 60, which I've never used, but landscape, portrait, stuff like that. The camera settings are biased towards that subject matter. It's very clever. And then there's the semi-automatic modes where you select the aperture and the camera selects the shutter speed, and that's AV mode or aperture priority mode. And the other one where you select the shutter speed and the camera selects the aperture, which is time value or shutter priority mode. I've got those the wrong way round. I knew there was something wrong with this. Semi-automatic mode where you select the aperture and the camera selects the shutter speed. Semi-automatic mode where you select the aperture and the camera selects the shutter speed. AV mode or aperture priority mode. Or the other one where you select the shutter speed and the camera selects the aperture, which is time value or shutter priority mode, depending on your camera manufacturer. I had a bit of a moment with those because I thought I'd gone the wrong way round, but I hadn't. I thought it said shutter speed. Yeah, I got myself confused then. I'm okay, I can carry on. And finally, manual mode. You set everything. The camera ignores the meter reading, it just takes the photo with the settings that you set. In the semi-automatic modes, it's choosing either the aperture or the shutter speed to give you the correct exposure. Don't forget, in manual mode, it's all down to you completely. Right, but which picture-taking mode should you use? Well, it depends. Beginner photographers tend to start with the automatic mode, which is fine. That's what I started with. Program mode is a popular general mode, and it's spelled PROGRAM. I thought up until, well, last year, it was spelled PROGRAMME. It's not. So you start in the automatic modes, and then you progress to the semi-automatic modes, and then manual mode when you get more advanced. I use AV mode. I set the aperture to f8, the ISO is set at 100, the camera's on a tripod, so the shutter speed is whatever the camera decides to give the correct exposure. Just doesn't matter to me. But there are so many modes, it's impossible for me to tell you what to use. And I'll say it again, there's nothing wrong with the scene-specific modes. If these help you take photos, use them. The aim, though, is to be able to use manual mode. If you can get your head around manual mode, it will help you when you need it. And it will help you understand what's going on with aperture, shutter speed. It will help you understand exposure as a whole. And you can use the data from your photos to help you. Even if you've used an automatic mode, the data is still there, which tells you what the camera settings are. And it helps you to learn. So have a look at your photos and see what the camera selected to get the correct exposure. I'll come back to manual mode in a minute. White balance. What is white balance and why is it important? Well, it's very important. White balance is how you capture natural looking colours according to the lighting. And we start here with getting white. Might sound stupid, but white needs to be white. Us humans, with the naked eye, white tends to look white regardless of the lighting conditions because our eyes adjust to the lighting conditions, but a camera doesn't do that. A camera captures what's there. If you take photos in RAW, you can use auto white balance and you can correct them later. If you're using JPEG, you can't do this, not to the same degree. In RAW, you've got all the white balance presets and you can just go from one to the other. It's amazing. I mean, we can make this as complicated as we want to, but basically, we humans generally see white things as white. The camera, however, captures whatever the colour temperature of that light is, which is why we need to correct it. And this is how I do it. I put a grey card in the photo. It's not a card, but it is grey. And I take the photo using auto white balance. And then later on in Lightroom, I can select the grey card with the white balance eyedropper tool, and 99 times out of 100, that is me done with white balance. We can make these things as easy or as hard as we want to, and I choose easy if it works. Okay, manual mode, I need to come back to this. Manual mode, do I really need to learn this? Well, I think you do. You don't have to take every photo using manual mode, but learning to do so will help you. If you learn how to use manual settings, you don't have to use them all the time, but they will be there when you need them, and you will need them at some point. And manual mode, it gives you full control of the exposure, which is nice, isn't it? I use AV mode for 99% of my photos. If I've got a problem with an exposure because it's complex lighting, I'll use manual mode. That's all I ever do. AV mode and then manual mode when I need it. And if I didn't know how to use manual mode, I'd have a problem. So learn it, but you don't have to use it. Just be aware of how to do it. Right, big question. To autofocus or to not autofocus? I might get shot down here. I cannot think of a single reason not to use autofocus. The last time I used manual focus was when I was using a tilt-shift lens. And I didn't have a choice because tilt-shift lens is a manual focus. So, use autofocus, why wouldn't you? Other than the tilt-shift lens, I can't tell you when I last manually focused to take a photo. And we're probably going back to before autofocus was a thing, which, yeah, that's quite a few years ago. So, yeah, I don't need to say any more on that one, do I? And there will be people who say, no, Rick, you're wrong. You should manually focus. You're not a real photographer unless you manually focus every shot and obviously take photos in manual mode. And to them I say, whatever, I'm happy using autofocus. So we use autofocus and there are different options within your camera, different settings, different modes. So drive modes, well, cameras have got different settings, different drive modes, and they include single shot, continuous shooting, silent modes, and probably many others. Like the self-timer I use. Find out what works for you and what you're photographing. Single shot will be fine for things that aren't moving, but you'll probably want to use a continuous shooting mode for things that are moving quickly. Makes sense, doesn't it? Live view. This is what Canon call using the LCD screen on the back to take photos. Now, if you've got a mirrorless camera, you'll have an electronic viewfinder as well. My Canon 6D is a DSLR, so it's got an optical viewfinder. So, which do you use? Well, most people use the viewfinder. I use the viewfinder and the LCD screen. I use both. It's just how I work. Find out what you prefer. I tend to frame a shot with the optical viewfinder, then I have a look at it on the screen, small as it is, with my aging eyes. And I go between the two. Up to you. Do whatever you want. But I use both to help me get the best compositions. Have a go, see how it works for you. Right, I mentioned it briefly before, self-timer. Yes, the not much talked about self-timer built into a camera. My Canon 6D's got a 2-second self-timer and a 10-second self-timer. You could take photos of yourself using this, and that's what we used to do before phones and selfies existed. So if you're thinking selfies are a new thing, they're not. No. We used to stand in front of the camera for 10 seconds waiting for the shutter to go. How natural those photos were. But there is a more important use for a self-timer other than taking photos of yourself, staring at your own camera, trying to work out when the 10 seconds is going to end, so you're not blinking when the photo's taken. No, the more important feature is this. Use the self-timer to minimise the chance of getting camera shake with your camera on a tripod. This helps me to get the sharpest photos I can, and that has to be a good thing, right? So when I'm taking photos with my camera on a tripod, I don't press the shutter button and take a photo. I press the shutter button, which activates the self-timer, and 10 seconds later, a photo is taken. Well, I say one photo, 3 photos are taken, which moves me seamlessly, blimey that, That's a surprise, isn't it? On to auto bracketing. Auto bracketing, well, what's that, Rick? Auto bracketing is a thing where the camera takes more than one photo at the same time, but with different exposures. Alright, so why would we want to do this? Well, I photograph buildings, so I'm going to give you a very practical example that we can all understand, hopefully. Right, imagine you're photographing a room on a sunny day. The window's really bright, and the shadows in the room are really dark. And the rest of the room, it's somewhere in between, isn't it? Okay, so take one photo, the window will be overexposed, and the shadows will be underexposed, and the stuff in the middle might not look great either. How bad they look, it varies with how bright and dark the respective areas are. So this is what we do. Take a photo with the correct exposure for the content of the window. Take another photo with the correct exposure for the content of the shadows. And take a third photo of the general room, and then you got these 3 different areas of light and everything in between in theory. This is auto bracketing. Okay, so you've taken 3 different photos, 3 different exposures of the same thing. That's all auto bracketing is. You're just telling it to take photos over and underexposed by a number of stops defined by you. So the camera's doing it for you, which saves you time, and it helps you to capture more of the range of light in a scene. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just don't call it HDR and you'll be fine. Just saying. Metering modes. There are many metering modes. My Canon 6D has evaluative, partial, spot and center-weighted metering modes. Your camera will have similar ones, probably more than that, but they'll be in there somewhere. They might be called different things. And the default on the Canon 6D is evaluative metering, which I use. I just wish I could say it. So try them out, see which works for you. And when I say try them out, I mean take the same photo using each mode and compare the results and see what works for you and which you prefer. You might want to change for different situations, different subject matters, different compositions, but I don't, to be honest with you. I've been using evaluative metering for donkey's years. Okay, some lens-related stuff. Right, focal lengths. Now, I talked about this in the last episode, the focal lengths of wide-angle, standard and telephoto lenses, and the impact of the focal length of the different camera sensor types and sizes. So, we don't need to go through that again, do we? No, we don't, Rick. Image stabilization. Now, I don't have this on my Canon 6D. I don't have it on my 17 to 40mm lens. And I don't have it on my 24 to 105mm lens. But I do have it on my 70 to 200 f4L IS lens. IS for image stabilization. And it has 4 stops of image stabilization. And I do believe it was the first camera lens to have 4 stops of image stabilization. But what does this mean? Right. I like this. This is a good one, this. So, suppose I were to take a photo handheld using a 200mm focal length, with an ISO of 100, of course. I've covered that already. My shutter speed would need to be 1/250th of a second or faster, which I covered earlier, didn't I? Now, with 4 stops of image stabilization, this is what happens. This is remarkable. You can reduce the shutter speed by 4 stops and get the same results as with the original shutter speed. We're starting at 1/250th of a second. So 1 stop takes us to 1/125th of a second, 2 stops 1/60th of a second, 3 stops 1/30th of a second, 4 stops 1/15th of a second. Yes, you can take a photo handheld with a shutter speed of 1/15th of a second using a 200mm focal length and get results as good as you would with the 1/250th of a second shutter speed. It's unbelievable, isn't it? That is absolutely remarkable. And you can also get image stabilization in camera bodies now, which is an exciting thing. Just to give some context to this, a 4-stop ISO adjustment starting at 100, that'll take you to 200, 400, 800, 1600. So a 4-stop adjustment of ISO gets you to ISO 1600, and you're probably starting to bring out digital bad stuff. So if you had a camera with image stabilization, you'd use that and keep the ISO low. And this is how gear helps us to take better photos. We just need to know about this stuff, don't we? Right, how could a tripod help me take better photos? Well, simple. First, with a tripod, you do not need to use a fast shutter speed or a high ISO to get sharp photos in low light or indeed any light. So whatever the lighting conditions, you're fine. And you don't have to use a tripod only in low light. I use mine all the time. If the light's really bright, I still use my tripod. I was going to say I don't not use my tripod then, but that's hardly English, is it? No, any lighting, I still use my tripod, and there's a reason why. Because it's helping to get the highest quality, sharpest photos every time using the lowest ISO. But it's helping me to get better compositions. It slows me down. It stops me taking rubbish, unthought of photos. So I take fewer photos, and the photos I take are much more thought about, much more considered, much better. So it can't be a bad thing, can it, to take fewer photos but to a higher standard? It can't be bad, can it? Of course it can't. And that's why I use a tripod. The talky bit. Well, the title of this episode initially was Camera Settings, How to Get Image Capture Bang On. And that's the point of this. Using the camera settings to get the best photos that we can. Now, different camera manufacturers have got different settings and names for things, of course they do. And digital cameras all have their own individual things within them too. And that's why I've stuck to my Canon 6D, because I could tell you what I have, what I use, what I do. And the best camera settings for you, they might not be the same as they are for me, but what I've done is I've given you something to think about and something for you to start with and work with. Hopefully this is helping you to think about how you can change the camera settings to take better photos yourself. Okay, I think I've covered everything I want to say, so I'm going to move on. If I don't, we're going to be here all day, which I don't think any of us want, do we? Well, I'm quite happy to, but I'm sure you've got better things to do. What if I use my phone to take photos and not a camera? Well, take me as an example, for a change. I take photos using the default camera app. I use different lenses. I change from photo to video capture and use the front lens and the rear lens depending on whether I'm in a photo or not. And that's it. I have nothing more to say on how I use my phone. It's just so instinctive. I don't need to think about it. It's brilliant. It's completely different to taking photos with my camera. And I know that and accept it. And I'm fine with that. What if I have a film camera? Right, I'm going to stop talking about this because I'm doing such a poor job with it. So this is the last time you're going to hear me say this. Unless there's an outcry, of course. Which there won't be, I know. Now, I think it was a nice idea, but I'm going to leave this for other folk who know much more about film photography. It's not what I do anymore, and it hasn't been for many years, so that's it. Bye, film camera. Sorry. I've moved on. Okay, what do I do? Well, I'm going to go through the list that I went through at the beginning and tell you what I do. AV mode on my full-frame Canon 6D. Aperture f8. Shutter speed determined by the camera. ISO 100. Raw image quality, the highest quality setting on my Canon 6D. AV mode, auto white balance, autofocus on, focus mode one shot. Oh yeah, and I manually select one of the 11 focus points available for each photo. Yes, Canon 6D, 11 focus points, and I just use one of them. What would I do if I had 5,000? I have no idea. Drive mode, single shot. Live view, I use this and the optical viewfinder to help me get the best compositions. Self-timer set to 10 seconds. Auto bracketing, taking 3 photos, the first, the correct exposure, 1 2 stops overexposed, 1 2 stops underexposed. Evaluative metering mode, 17mm focal length, with my camera on a tripod. That's what I do. And I don't use the exposure triangle. And I can't tell you when I last used it, so there you go. And the reason I don't use the exposure triangle is that I don't change the ISO unless I have to. And that's it. No, I use these settings to get the best composed, technically correct, tack-sharp images every time I take a photo. This is what I do. Right, some thoughts from the last episode quickly. Well, I say quickly, 45 minutes long. Blimey, I got that one wrong, didn't I? Much longer than I expected, but I'm fine with that. I always say that the episode length is determined by what I want to say. I don't try and shoe on things into a certain time or just waffle on to fill out the time. The length of each episode is what it is, so I'm happy with that. But I did want to pick up on the saving time thing, other than listening to that lengthy episode, that is. I mentioned this in the last episode about saving time by buying new gear, and I'd save time if I bought a camera that did the auto bracketing and created a single raw HDR file automatically. And if this was 1 hour of work for each shoot, that'd add up over the number of years I keep a camera for, which will pay me back in, I don't know, probably a couple of years. So it's well worth doing. It's paid me back in a couple of years and I've got a camera. So that's how I view gear. It's equipment, and some of it does have a payback time, which can help justify buying it. I'm arguing against myself now, aren't I? Now, I know you might not be earning money from your photography, but you could put a value on your time as well, and you might find that you can quickly justify some new kit using the payback thing, and that'd be quite a smart thing to do, wouldn't it? Next episode, phone or camera, which do you use? This is going to be interesting, and I'm a little bit nervous about this one. It could be very short. It could be a very short episode indeed, because, let's see. I'm looking forward to this one. I see this one as a challenge. Right, ask me a question. If you have a question you would like me to answer, email me, sales@rickmcavoyphotography.co.uk. I know I need a shorter email address. Or head over to the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start. And check out the questions page where there's a big old list of things you can choose from, which I've just updated this week. So the list is much bigger than it was, and it's much better. So have a look, and if you want to pick something off the list, I'm absolutely fine with that. And if you just want to say hi, say hi. I love hearing from my listeners, regardless of what you got to say to me, as long as it's nice. Get an email from me. Well, if you would like to receive a weekly email from me where I tell you what I'm thinking about, fill out the form on the podcast website, and every Friday you will get a lovely email from me. How utterly splendid. Okay, I'm done. This episode was brought to you by a homemade, wait for it, a homemade cheese and pickle sandwich washed down with a Coke Zero, not water, take out the water, before I settled down in my homemade acoustically cushioned recording emporium. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, It Says Here, and for giving me 27-ish minutes of your valuable time. Now, I reckon this episode will be about 35-37 minutes long after I've edited out the mistakes and other bad stuff. The next episode might be 10 minutes just to make up for it. Anyway, hope to see you on the next episode. Take care, stay safe. Cheers from me, Rick. My brand new course, How to Become a Real Estate Photographer, straight talking advice for beginners to get you making money quickly and build a career, is available to buy now. Find out more at rickmcavoyphotography.com/courses.